Well, when I was in the middle of first grade, Esther and Sydney were married, lived in a little apartment in Chicago, and when Esther became pregnant, she wanted to be near her big sister, Pearl. She felt that she needed the mentoring and she wanted the company, and in those days, families doubled up often. It was not unusual. So they found a big apartment, 6437 North Leavitt. It was a 3-flat brick in West Rogers Park, a half a block or 1 block from Devon Avenue, and it was the only apartment building standing on the block. These buildings had been built in the late 20s, and when the Depression came, all buildings stopped. So West Rogers Park was a prairie, except for freestanding buildings here and there. I walked to Stone School. I was the new girl in the middle of the semester of the year. The teacher asked me one afternoon why I wasn't in my seat after recess. Recess? In Maywood, we didn't have an afternoon recess. So when all the children went out into the schoolyard, I assumed school was over. I didn't have any friends. I was the new girl. I didn't know anybody to ask, so I went home. I thought it was the end of the day. After about 3 or 4 days, the teacher caught on and asked me, and I learned about afternoon recess. I was always the new girl in class. We moved so that I was in a new school 4 times by the time I was in 4th grade. But we'll get to that. That year that we lived with Esther and Sydney was the most wonderful year of my childhood. I loved Aunt Esther, of course. My mother was busy finding friends that she could play cards with. My father was on the road, and they divided the work. Esther was the babysitter for me and my brother, the second brother, and my mother did all the cooking, and they shared the cleaning. And they were such good companions. Yak, yak, yak all day long. They never found that there was not enough to talk about. But Esther became my surrogate mother. In the morning, she made my curls and dressed me for school, gave me breakfast, and as she took care of her little baby, who was named Dawn, and that became Dawn Rossett from the Dawn Schumann, well, her maiden name was Rossett, Dawn Schumann adult learning programs for which she was loved and famous. She was a very gifted teacher. But I knew her as an infant in those days, little blonde, curly-haired infant. And my brother was 2, and my friend was Aunt Esther. I'd come home for lunch, as we all did in those days, and she'd make me a butterball omelet, and she always dressed it fancy with something on the side to tempt me because I was not a good eater. And after school, while she was taking care of her baby, she would tell me stories. I remember sitting there crying copious tears over the story Nello and Petrache. In Flanders, Petrache was a man who carried, who drove a little cart to sell milk. Petrache was the dog that pulled the cart. And when Petrache died, I couldn't get over it. But I loved Esther's stories, and she read to me. And my Uncle Sidney took books to the library and brought them to me that he thought I would like. The Honey Bunch series, the Bobbsey Twins series. I could barely read, but I did. I followed the books because it was a gift. I never had this before, this attention, this loving attention. Now, Sid was a fine singer. He studied voice. He even sang professionally a bit with the octet at the Heidelberg restaurant. But Esther played the piano. Self-taught. She played ragtime, she played jazz, all by ear. She accompanied Sid. Every evening we had a concert. He sang and she played, and I remember those wonderful songs, On the Road to Mandalay, in his baritone. I enjoyed it so much. And then my Uncle Sidney would play tricks with me. And I was never lonely. My brother was 2 years old, so he was no company. But I had Esther and Sidney, and it was a remarkable year. I'll never forget it because it formed the bond that we carried until their deaths. So, that year, they had to break up this lovely apartment because the Depression came and my Uncle Sidney was at a loss. His electrical contracting business failed. There was no construction going on. And they were forced to move back to Maywood to share Grandma's apartment. So my mother looked for a smaller place, which was in another neighborhood and another school. That was on Sherwin Avenue, near the lake, which was fun. And I went to Eugene Field School. That was the year that I was double promoted. And I don't know if they ever did me a favor doing that. I was so frightened going from the middle of 3rd grade into the middle of 4th grade. I thought that I would be humiliated because I wouldn't know the work. It never occurred to me that the teacher knew I didn't know it. But when I saw long division problems on the blackboard, I'd never seen a long division problem. It looked so complex to me that I quaked, thinking, what if she calls on me and I won't know how to do it? I'll be so ashamed. I began throwing up every day on the way to school. And one day, the teacher said, Roslyn, will you carry this note to the principal's office for me? I thought, here it is, doomsday. She's going to tell the principal that I don't know anything. And then what will I do? I'll be put back in 3rd grade? I went to the principal's office trembling, literally trembling. I stood on this brown linoleum. I will never forget the look of it. He had a high, like a counter behind which he sat. And I handed him the note. And as he read the note, I felt this warm gush. I was wetting my pants. And it trickled onto this linoleum with a brrr sound, echoed. And I thought I would die. And the principal looked over his counter and he said, are you sick? I couldn't speak. He went to the telephone after looking up our telephone number, called my mother and said, come to school and get your little girl. She's had an accident. And bring her a clean underwear and stockings. We wore ribbed beige lisle stockings with garters. I sat on a little bench in the office, dying of fright, thinking that someone would come in and know what happened to me. The janitor came in, mopped up the floor, and I thought, if anybody from my room comes, I'll die. Well, my mother got there, and she begins to undress me in the principal's office. She pulls off my panties and stockings, and she begins to put the other. Why didn't I say, Mother, not here? I couldn't. My mother was the ruler, you know. And you fell in line, whatever your mother said. We children knew that we were second-class citizens. We didn't have authority. Well, my mother took me home. And in those days, it was very rare to have a pediatrician. But there was one in Chicago, a Dr. Tumpier, that my mother took me for examination. At Antiem, at the synagogue we go to now, there is a window, a stained glass window donated by the Tumpier family. Anyway, Dr. Tumpier said, "What is this child afraid of?" And my mother got the inkling that it must have something to do with school. The fact that I was double promoted. He said, "Bed rest for 3 weeks." Well, I thought, this is terrible. I'll fall behind in my classes. This is worse than not knowing log division. So my mother took me home and put me to bed. I was so worried. And after the second or third day, my mother figured out that maybe she could find out what was wrong in school. So she went to see the teacher. My mother had a lot of smarts. She was very wise when it came to people and situations, and she could read them like that. So she got the idea, she suggested to the teacher, said, maybe if you give Rosie some little task to do for you, she'll feel more at home in the classroom. She won't be so afraid. So the teacher said, well, I could have her water the plants. My mother said, it's a great idea. So I was told I could go back to school, come in the classroom 5 minutes early, and water the plants for Mrs. Durso, which I did, and it settled me. I knew Mrs. Durso was my friend, and I learned long division, and I thrived. When I got to college, and you had to fill out the form for your medical history. After the second day I was there, I was called into the office at the infirmary, and a doctor would interview me. I thought this is what they do in college. And he said, I see here on your application that you had a nervous breakdown. I said, oh yes, when I was 9 years old. He said, tell me, what happened? I told him what happened. He said, where did you think that was a nervous breakdown? I said, my mother told me. My mother and her mother and sisters had the idea that delicacy gave you a lot of prestige. And the more delicate and the less appetite and the more unhealthy you were, the classier it was. So my mother gave me the reputation. I had a nervous breakdown, like a princess. I learned the hard way. So then after that, we moved to 5437 North Winthrop, and I went to Gowdy School. By this time, this was the 4th school, and we always stayed in that district, so Gowdy was my school. Gowdy was where I began to make friends. I began to be invited to birthday parties. I had dates after school to go to the park or make paper dolls, play dress up in each other's homes. It was joyful. And that's where I met the little girl who became my staunch companion, tight chums from 4th grade all through our school years, and that was Edna Roth. And we met every day, walked to school together. We were rivals. As much as we loved each other, we were fierce rivals in school because we were always earning the 2 top grades. If Edna got a 99 and I got a 98, the next day I'd get the 99 and Edna would get the 98. And we counted the Valentines. In those days, not every child got a Valentine. You only gave Valentines to the kids you liked. How cruel. But so we would count each other's Valentines to make sure that one didn't get ahead of the other.